100%. I think maybe important to say out loud because people feel really alone in this journey. The more people talk about egg donation as an option, the better. But right now, a huge part of the donor egg program are advanced maternal age moms who tried on their own for years. And now this is the next option. It's almost my full-time job to support families like this. And we're very happy to have you and know that you are not alone. There's lots of people doing this.
Hi, superhumans. I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise.
We're two of the physician leaders at Markham Fertility Centre, otherwise known as our baby, MFC.
As fertility specialists, we've witnessed firsthand the challenges, triumphs, and the myriad of emotions that come with trying to conceive. Whether you're just starting to think about having a baby, actively trying, or facing challenges along the way, My Fertility Podcast will be your go-to resource for honest conversations and a supportive community.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea and settle in, and let's demystify the world of fertility together.
On today's episode of My Fertility Podcast, we are joined by Stefanie McGlynn, our program lead and nurse extraordinaire for the Donor and Surrogacy Program here at Markham Fertility Centre. The Donor and Surrogacy Program encompasses donor egg, donor sperm, and gestational carriers or surrogacy. On today's episode, we're going to be focusing on donor eggs. We're going to be talking about known donors, about frozen egg banks. We're going to be talking about fresh donors. And we're going to go through the process, the logistics, costs, how to pick an egg donor. We're very excited to be joined by Stefanie, who is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the DNS area.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Stefanie. It is such a pleasure to work with you, and I'm very excited for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about the Donor and Surrogacy Program.
Speaking of the donor and surrogacy program, tell me, why is a donor and surrogacy program needed in fertility clinics? And what do you think is special about the donor and surrogacy program at Markham Fertility Centre?
For sure. So I think that navigating infertility or family building is really challenging. Just baseline infertility or family building is complicated. When you add in a third party, whether that's a donor or a surrogate or embryo donation or anything like that, the complexity doesn't double, it like quadruples, it's exponential. And I think that having some dedicated people who their whole job is understanding that process and learning the supports that are out there and the different providers that you can connect with, I think just helps to lighten the load a little bit for the families that are going through it. Not a lot. It's still a lot for them to navigate, but having people who understand a little bit about what's out there helps to just ease the burden a little bit. So you've got one place where you can ask questions, one place where you can go to for information to at least get started on the journey. And then what's unique about the program at Markham Fertility Centre is that we have a dedicated donor and surrogacy teams. In our clinic, starting in about late 2020, early 2021, Markham Fertility decided to sort of establish this dedicated team, which was me at first, and now is a full team with myself and another nurse coordinator, a dedicated admin team, and then also heavy support from our genetics team as well. And our whole job, day in and day out, full time, is supporting people who have a third party involved in their journey, whether that's a donor or a surrogate. And we help from the very beginning. We meet with people at the very beginning when they have maybe not even started looking for a donor or don't even know that they need a donor. We help navigate that process, understanding what to look for, where to go, what the costs are, what the timelines are, what do I think about, what steps should I take. We help them get connected with genetics, get through the process of selecting their donor, using that donor, whether it's for IUI or embryo creation, and then through first trimester pregnancy. So you have the same people from the beginning of the journey all the way through to the end that really have the big picture of where you've been and where you're going and all the complexities that are involved in your journey along the way. And I think that that really helps people to feel like they have consistency and like they have a team that they can rely on because they've remained consistent throughout the journey.
I love that. And I think you can probably speak about the bonds and the relationship that you develop with patients when you are really their person for such a long time. Unfortunately, usually it's a long time, but also for such a personal, vulnerable time as well.
Absolutely. I didn't mention this, but of course your doctor remains consistent as well. And I know those same relationships happen with the doctor. But my favorite part, and this is like sort of like secretly behind the scenes, we know, especially when it comes to like donors who are coming into clinic, we know the donor and we know the intended parents and then maybe the surrogate. And it's so cool to see it all come together and to have been a part of all of those journeys because they are all individual and unique. And it's really cool to see it all come together. And, even hearing about sometimes we have family members who act as donors for one another or surrogates for one another. And it's really awesome to hear updates about how sister's doing who donated to you or how brother's doing who donated to you. And it's just that long-term relationship that makes this job really rewarding.
I'm so excited to be able to chat with you and have you on the podcast, Stephanie, because I feel like you and the team really are the secret weapons right here at MFC. No, I'm serious. In the sense that you guys are so knowledgeable about all the different aspects of donor and surrogacy, third-party reproduction as well, because it's not simple and it's not easy, right? I personally don't even know the answers to all the questions about the certain regulations and rules, but you're in it day in and day out. And so you're so well versed in all of these things. Not only are you building those incredible bonds and the relationships, but also the knowledge there and that expertise, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about some of those challenges with Health Canada, for instance?
I really appreciate you highlighting the complexities. And I always like to say, especially in third party, like it's nice to hear that we're viewed as maybe experts or people who know a lot. But actually, what I think that we're really good at is knowing what we know and knowing what we don't know, and then figuring out the pieces that we don't know, because things come to us every day, multiple times a day that we haven't encountered before, that we don't know exactly where to go with. But we have this foundation of information that helps us to ask the right questions to the right people, hopefully at the right time. And I think that's where the secret sauce is, really. I say to patients all the time that I picture our team as like traffic cops, just like standing in the middle of the intersection, making sure that people are going where they need to go at the right time. And hopefully we can anticipate the accident and change the direction of traffic before we get there. And I think to your question, the challenges that come up are really about a lot of regulatory stuff. So as I think many people who encounter third party are familiar with, safety of sperm and ovum regulations came into force in February 2020, and they really changed the way that third party reproduction is happening in Canada. And so it has a lot to do with, particularly for donors, very sensitive timing and testing that needs to be completed and making sure that patients are aware of what that is, what the additional cost is for those things, and how the timing of it is really specific, which is a struggle for people. Why can't I just go to the lab tomorrow? Why does it have to be today? And so that's one of the challenges that comes up. And then there's the issue around just access to donors and surrogates. In Canada, at least, it can be really difficult sometimes to have access to the part of third-party reproduction that you need, especially surrogacy, but sometimes donors too. There can be a limited pool in terms of ethnic diversity and cultural considerations and things like that to think about. And then a big part of our job is navigating the different resources out there and agencies and banks and things to make sure that we're have as many options available to our patients as is reasonable and safe and suitable. Those are definitely the biggest challenges.
Let's talk about egg donors. So I'm a patient. I've seen my fertility doctor, Markham Fertility Centre, and I've been referred to the donor and surrogacy program looking for an egg donor. Can you walk us through that process as if you were talking to somebody who's just starting on the journey of figuring this out?
For sure. So in my mind, I like to divide it into two categories: fresh egg donors or frozen egg donors. A fresh egg donor is either a person who you know or somebody who you're matched with through an agency who might be non-identified. Like you said, it might be somebody who you don't connect with, at least not right away. Or there's frozen egg donors, and those are people who have been screened and stimulated, had their eggs retrieved somewhere else, and then their eggs are banked. Usually these donors are from the United States. And so what we talk about when we're getting started is that, number one, we really at MFC recommend fresh eggs over frozen eggs. And the reason for that is all in the numbers. So when it comes down to it, we expect between 3 to 6 good embryos out of a fresh egg donor cycle is typically what we're seeing. Out of a frozen egg donor cycle, we see 1 or maybe 2 good embryos for transfer, and that's sort of on average. And lots of times people come to me thinking, well, frozen eggs must be faster. And so truly, the timeline is about the same. From the time you purchase a frozen egg lot until the time you have embryos ready for transfer, on average is 2.5 to 3 months. But typically the workup time in terms of getting your frozen eggs purchased is a little bit longer, because usually you're having to submit some medical paperwork for yourself to the egg bank to qualify for some guarantees that they have. With a fresh egg donor, from the time you match with your donor until the time we have embryos ready for transfer is between 3 and 4 months on average. So the timeline really is pretty equal. And then the other thing is, people often think that frozen eggs are cheaper than fresh eggs. And in fact, the money out of your bank account is pretty similar at the end of the day. So with a frozen or fresh egg donor cycle, we expect between $40,000 to $45,000 total out of your bank account from when you choose your donor until the time you make embryos, with the only exception being if you have funding or if you have a known egg donor, those costs are going to be a little bit less because you don't have to pay an agency their fees for service. That's a big overview of fresh versus frozen.
Let's delve a little bit more into these donor egg banks first. Also, I think it's really important to point out that not all fertility clinics will offer this full complement of options. So, for instance, there are many fertility clinics that may only do, let's say, frozen eggs, but they don't offer fresh egg donor, or they may not offer gestational carriers or surrogacy, or they may only do known fresh egg donor, but not other types of fresh. Like, there's a lot of intricacy in what clinics are actually able to do and what they're actually offering. And I think a lot of it stems from the difficulties of navigating the regulations from Health Canada. Is that fair to say?
I agree. And I've heard sort of anecdotally is a lot of clinics really pulled back on their third-party offerings when the regulations came out in 2020. And I think COVID probably had something to do with that as well. It was like there's, kind of reached a critical mass of what we can deal with at one time. I think that more and more clinics are starting to expand their program again, but it's happening slowly. So it is really important, if you're choosing a clinic and you need third party, to really understand what your options are at that clinic, because sometimes it's better to know up front than have to switch.
Absolutely. And I think that that's such a key point when somebody is choosing a clinic. Okay, let's delve into these donor egg banks. Who are they? Where are they? Where do they come from? Who are these people?
This is such a good question. And honestly, every time I watch somebody go through an egg donation cycle, I'm like, how did you get here? The donors that I have encountered are people who are good people who usually have some relationship with somebody who's either been through infertility or has used a donor themselves or was a donor themselves. And they have this desire to help somebody. They mostly all have their own, I shouldn't say mostly all, lots of them have their own kids, and they feel like they really want to help somebody else be able to achieve that kind of unconditional love that they've experienced. People say that to me a lot. And so I know that at least in Canada, these donors are recruited usually through things like university career fairs or job networking, where 20-somethings are hanging out. Out of like 100 people that apply to become an egg donor, I think 1 gets selected. Like, it is a pretty rigorous selection process through the agencies. And then when it comes to the banks, my understanding is it's pretty similar stuff that's happening, except it's happening in the United States, and the donors are getting paid. So in Canada, the Assisted Human Reproduction Act prohibits people from being paid directly for their gametes or for surrogacy. In the States, the donors are being paid. So there is some difference in motivation of why a donor might be willing to donate her eggs. And all of the frozen eggs that we use, at least at Markham Fertility, they do come from the United States. And the reason is they have a lot more donors because they are paying them to do that. So there's more availability of frozen eggs in the States. And then where it happens is all over the United States. There's kinds of different clinics that we get eggs from. They all come through 2 or 3 central egg banks, but they're screened and stimulated and frozen at clinics all over the place, which is helpful when you look at things like being able to access diverse donor pools and things like that. It's nice that they have sort of a web across the country, because you do get, still not great, but more cultural diversity.
If you have somebody who's trying to decide between using a frozen egg bank and a fresh, what kind of considerations they should be thinking about?
The first thing is, how many kids do they want to have, and how important is it to them that they have the same donor for multiple kids if more than one is the option. And this is an important message to say out loud. People say to me all the time, sheepishly, like, well, I'd be happy with just one, but it's okay to dream big. Like, what should we set you up for? If one is really all you want, then that's a different conversation. But if in your perfect world, you would have more than one child, then let's talk about that now so we can set you up for the possibility of that future. And in that case, don't even think about frozen eggs, just go straight to fresh, because we need more embryos to make sure that we have more higher chance of babies with the same donor. And then the other thing to think about is, when you use frozen eggs, very commonly, we need to try multiple egg lots in order to get to our baby. And that process is emotionally difficult because usually it means you're picking maybe multiple donors, one at a time, but still more than one donor, which is an emotional process for people to go through to select a donor. And so usually you have to do multiple egg lots, so you're picking multiple donors, and the timeline can be a bit longer if you are somebody who ends up having to go back for more than one egg lot, which is fairly common. But if you are somebody who really needs financial security, financial reassurance that you're going to get some financial recuperation if this doesn't work, then there are programs that are offered through egg banks that you can have some of that financial security, which is important. If you are looking at fresh eggs, the reason that people sometimes are nervous about fresh eggs is, people ask me all the time, well, what happens if the donor backs out? Because these are real people who have real lives, and absolutely it could happen that you get partway through and the donor is medically not fit, or the genetics don't work out, or the donor gets a new job and decides to not donate anymore. And so those are risks that you're taking when you choose a fresh egg donor. It really doesn't happen very often that a donor backs out, but it certainly could. And then you need to understand what the financial implication of that is. And then, of course, you're sort of resetting the clock on your timeline as well. Those are the big things that people usually come to me with. And the other thing that people talk about is, when the donor is actually physically coming into the clinic, some people feel like it's a little too close for comfort. They need more emotional distance from the donor, which is very fair. It's important to know that if you do choose a non-identified donor, or somebody who we used to call anonymous, that person in our clinic, you would never run into them. We have great processes in place to make sure that you're separated. But it is important to know that they are coming here. They're people that we know and we meet. All of the donors, whether you choose a donor from an egg bank or an agency, all of them have identity options available. So sometimes a donor will be what we call non-ID or non-identified, which means anonymous, but we're not calling it anonymous because anonymity just doesn't exist in 2024. So although the donor can't contact you and you can't contact them, we know that people are finding their donors through things as simple as facial recognition software. So they save a photo that they've gotten off the profile, and a child that's maybe conceived by a donor can find their donor through facial recognition software just on social media, or through things like 23andMe and Ancestry and things like that. People are getting connected through their donors. So it's important to just be really open with the fact that we know anonymity doesn't really exist, but there are lots of non-identified options out there where you don't have to know the donor doesn't have to know you right now, and then you can potentially connect the child with the donor in the future if that's something that your child wants or you want. And then there's also completely open donations. So not usually with egg banks, but with fresh egg donors for sure, you definitely have the possibility to select a donor who is open to meeting you before the cycle, or definitely open to meeting you once you have a child perhaps born. And all of these things are known in the donor profiles, which maybe we should talk about what a donor profile looks like.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whenever you're choosing an egg donor, whether it's a fresh or a frozen donor, you're going to be looking at this sort of catalog of profiles, which I always say to my patients that I talk to feels really weird. It's like shopping for humans. It's kind of like an online dating profile. It's a bit bizarre, but we're here for it and we love it. And we're so grateful for the donors who are willing to share their whole life in a profile. And so you'll see photos, usually childhood photos and adult photos. And if they have kids, usually their kids' photos are included as well. You'll see tons of information about them, their age, their social history, their religion, their cultural history, their education, their hobbies and interests, their height, their weight, their hair color, their eye color, their reported medical history, their family history, genetic testing, if they've done it, is sometimes included, their AMH. If they've cycled previously, that will be included as well. And you could read these profiles for days and soak in all the information that they share. They also usually share a blurb about why they're donating, what their motivation for donation is. So tons of information available about these people before you would be choosing to match with them.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Let's talk about the counseling part of it. As you know, we talk about it all the time. Sometimes when we mention to these couples that you've got to do some counseling, it can be seen as one more thing I have to do, one more barrier they're putting for me to get to my goal. It can seem punitive because, people who are not using donor gametes are not having counseling. And we all know about stories about people who bring children into the world that doesn't work out well in terms of family situations and things like that. So can you speak about that in terms of, is it a mandatory requirement? Yes or no? And what is it like? And what is your experience with people who are a bit resistant at first, but then do it?
For sure. You have psychological counseling, or sometimes implications counseling is what it's called. And there's also genetic counseling, which is different and we can talk about later. For psychological counseling or implications counseling, it is a mandatory part of the process at MFC, and it's under the guidelines of CFAS and ASRM and all of the smart people who make guidelines about how we should practice infertility. And it is, you're right, absolutely not punitive. It is meant to be a support and a place to get resources and to sort of air out any special considerations around bringing a third party sort of into your family. Patients very often feel a little hesitant about having to do this, but I have never had anybody come back to me after it was done and be upset that they did it. It's almost always, or in my experience, always really well received and found to be a helpful sort of part of the process. When you do it is up to you. At MFC, we say it must be done before your cycle starts. Usually you have several months lead time before that happens while you're getting all these ducks in a row with the donor egg. But really, I've started recommending as soon as people meet with me to just get started, I suggest now's a good time to book that appointment because the counselors are incredible at giving you all the things to think about. And one of the really important things that they help you sort of think through and contextualize is the relationship between yourself and the donor and your future child in terms of ID and non-ID, and what does this mean? And what if I choose a donor who I might know, and how does that impact my life? And how do I talk to my future children about donor conception? And I don't want to talk to my future children about donor conception, and what are some of those implications? And all of these things they talk through really well. And they can also help you wrap your head around what some of your non-negotiables might be when you're choosing a donor. So very often people will come with, like when you're house hunting, like a laundry list of the must-haves in the donor selection process. And sometimes that can be really limiting. So the counselors can be great at helping you really understand as a couple, if you're going into this with a partner, what some of the really important things are. And then they also provide lots of resources for talking to your support network, your friends, your family about donor conception, talking to your child eventually about the nature of their conception, and just really helping you sort of put all of the pieces of the puzzle into place. They are also great at even talking through the different fertility options and what might make the most sense for you. Or in the case of, for example, if there's two sperm providers in a relationship, what does the divide look like? And how do we each feel about the sperm from two sources? And all of these sorts of things, they're really wonderful at just giving you resources and tools. No answers, that's not what counselors are for, but all the things to think about and directions to sort of head in when you're talking to each other and to your child and to your support networks.
That's great. And there is certainly a lot to think about. And many times people don't know what they don't know, and they haven't realized what they haven't thought about. And counselors, because this is all they do and they see so much and have so much experience, are really great at anticipating what things may come up that you would just have no idea whatsoever unless you meet with them.
Yeah, exactly. And the counselors do provide a report back to your doctor. And I think that that's maybe why people think that there's some pass or fail element to it. But it's really important to say that there's no pass or fail element here for the intended parents. There is a little bit for the donors or the surrogates, but for the intended parents, this isn't a pass-fail thing. This is a conversation that's meant to be supportive and usually very well received. And yes, you can do it with any counselor that you want. The counselors have like a guideline that they manage in their own profession about what needs to be discussed in these appointments. And so if you have a counselor that you see regularly, you can ask them if they provide this service. Otherwise, we have a list of counselors who we recommend. And it's always important to check with your extended benefits providers if you have extended benefits, because there are social workers, there's psychotherapists, and there's psychologists that offer these sessions. And some benefits provider cover one, but not the other. And so you just want to make sure you're booking with the right type of provider.
I have to say, every single patient who I've ever had who's gone through implications counseling comes out saying, oh my God, that was amazing. I didn't know what to expect going into it, but it was so helpful and incredible.
Same. I get tons of good feedback, lots of hesitation, and then they
Yeah.
go, and then lots of good feedback. And every time I talk to those counselors, just in passing, I feel like I learn by osmosis every time I'm just in a room with them. They're wonderful at what they do, and they see so much. We can't downplay the importance of their role in this journey. It's really important and a very constructive place if you lean into it and let it be helpful.
We've spoken a lot about the first type of counseling, but then there's the other type of counseling that you alluded to, genetic counseling. This is really highlighted in this relatively new regulations that came from Health Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about this genetic counseling, what it is and how that works?
For sure. We are super lucky, and I think fairly unique, but you guys correct me if I'm wrong, in that we have this really dedicated and amazing genetic counseling team at Markham Fertility Centre.
Oh,
And
you're definitely not wrong about that. They are really incredible.
So incredible. And you're right, unique. There are very few fertility clinics that actually have their own dedicated genetic counselor. I can think of one other
Right.
clinic, maybe.
They're amazing over there. And I feel so privileged to work so closely with them. I just can't get enough. I just can't get enough. I think their job is amazing and they're so smart, and I don't know how they do it. The role of genetics in third-party reproduction is highlighted because we're introducing another person, especially when we're talking about donor egg, into the story. So typically, if you have a couple that has an egg and a sperm, there's certainly a role for genetics, but usually you're probably not changing your egg and sperm anyways. So we just sometimes have some genetic counseling, but it's not as highlighted. When you're choosing an egg donor, we now have the ability to think a little bit harder about what we're introducing by bringing this person in. The way that we do that in our program is through something called extended or expanded carrier screening, or ECS. In all of the donors, sperm or egg, who were processed through a sperm bank will have had this testing done already. And anybody who comes to us as a fresh donor, we do it as a regular part of our program as well. And the most important thing is that the intended parents, even well before they're choosing a donor, they're speaking with our genetics team to understand what this testing is, what it tells us, and what it doesn't tell us about a particular donor, and then give you the option to potentially, in the case of an egg donor, to test the sperm provider to understand how these two egg and sperm basically match up together. So expanded carrier screening, and I'm sure that you'll have a whole episode at some point, but in a nutshell, the way that I explain it to people is that expanded carrier screening looks for a whole battery of recessive conditions. So conditions that a person might be a carrier for, that they don't necessarily have symptoms of. They don't know that they're a carrier for that thing. It generally doesn't impact their health usually. But when it's combined with another person who carries that same condition, there's a higher risk of that condition or that thing occurring in the child. And so our genetics team helps patients to understand testing and understand all the different options in it. So very often people will say to me, I've had genetic testing done, I'm good, I don't need anything else. But what's really important to know is there's hundreds and hundreds of genes that can be tested for. I think the most common panel right now is over 600 different genes. But depending on what panel you've had done, you've been tested for some of those, but maybe not all of them. And similarly, your donor has tested for some of those, but maybe not all of them. And so matching the genetics reports together to understand what you were tested for, what your donor tested for, and how they match together is important. And really, like, you can do this on your own. I'm not totally sure that I could do it on my own, but our genetics team is here to help with that, to take some of that burden off of you so that you don't feel like you have to really understand these reports, because they are long and complicated And some of the conditions you probably want to know about, and other ones are not so significant. And our genetic counselors will help you understand what those are and what they mean and how it might impact your decision for or against a particular donor. And the other thing that's really important that I talk about all the time is that what you do with this genetic counseling and the genetic testing is totally up to you. So there's no judgment or assumptions on our part about what you would do if you found out that your sperm provider and your egg donor carried the same condition. You could certainly choose to continue with that donor potentially, but we want you to have the information. We want you to be making informed decisions about moving forward.
What are some of the costs associated with using the carrier screening?
That's a really important question. If you're choosing a frozen donor, then that testing's already been done on your donor. If you're doing a donor here, the testing is included in the costs that you're paying for donors here. If you decide to test yourself or your partner, the cost for expanded carrier screening is about $500 per person. For example, if it was a heterosexual couple and you're using an egg donor, then you would only be testing the sperm provider, the male partner. If you're a same-sex male couple and you're both planning to provide sperm, then you would probably both want to do expanded carrier screening. And that's another important consideration in family building with same-sex couples, is thinking about leaving the option open for using both parties as providers when you're choosing your donor. If one of you is going to do expanded carrier screening, it makes sense to do both at the same time. So you choose a donor that matches with both of you from the get-go.
And how long do results take?
About 3 weeks.
So we talked a lot about the donor profiles and all the information you get on there, but these donor profiles can be very overwhelming. Sometimes you almost, in a way, feels like you get too much information. Really common question that comes up all the time is, how in the world do I navigate through all this information? How do I choose a donor?
Yeah, it's really important. And so for egg donors, it boils down to 3 or 4 things. The first one is proven fertility. This is like at the top of the list, but even like miles above the top of the list. And what that means is somebody who has their own child, so their eggs have been proven because they've resulted in pregnancy before, or even better, somebody who has donated before and we have some record of what happened with that donation. And that can be a little bit tricky. So very often, if a donor has donated before, she will be able to get donation records and we'll know what happened with her stimulation and we'll know how many eggs were retrieved. We don't always know what happened with those eggs because that information belongs to the intended parent. So they have to be willing to sort of share those records. But very often we can get that information. Lots of intended parents are willing to share it. And we work with the agencies to help understand that. Or with the banks. If it was from an egg bank, we would work with them to ask for cycle reports on what happened with the previous person. If it's a frozen egg donor, the number of eggs that were retrieved is not so important because we already know that they have them. There's 6 eggs frozen for you. And then the other thing is age. So at Markham Fertility Centre, we say ideally somebody who is 32 or younger at the time that she's going to donate for you. And there are a fair few donors who are 32, 33, 34 sometimes, especially in the fresh egg donation side of things. So it's important to say that nothing magic happens at 32, but it's sort of one more thing to put in the list of things to consider that we're really aiming for 32 or younger, ideally. And then if it's a fresh egg donor, oftentimes their AMH is available on the profile, and we look for an AMH of 15 or higher. And then the final piece to think about from a fresh egg donor perspective is, where is she? Because usually they're coming from, I would say about half are local in the GTA area, and about half of them are coming from BC or Alberta or sometimes out east. And those cycles have a little bit of a higher cost because of the travel associated.
Now, I think it's important to mention that when we're talking about a known egg donor, let's say it's your sister or your friend, I mean, that criteria is a little bit less strict because you are already saying, this is the genetics that I really want. That would be the example of a sister. So we have egg donors that are older, 35, 40, with low AMH. Of course, it requires a discussion with intended parents and the donor, how this is not an ideal situation in terms of getting like perfect egg donor on paper, but some people just really want that particular genetic or that connection with the donor. And then we can certainly facilitate that with a good discussion with both donors and intended parents.
Totally. And I think it's really important to say that everything that I just said is what we recommend. And so every time people are choosing their donors, very often they'll send me or send the team a profile and say, what do you think about this donor? And we just go through weighing the pros and cons. It's almost never a yes or a no, unless it comes down to a safety issue for the donor. And that is important to say. We do have a limit that we try to stick to at MFC of 6 stimulated cycles in a lifetime for a donor. So if you bring me a donor who has cycled already 8 times, I'm going to say this person unfortunately can't cycle with us. There are clinics who cycle people further than that. And so that's why those donors exist, and you'll see them on the websites. But we try to stick to 6 or less at Markham Fertility Centre. Sometimes we don't know that they've cycled more than 6 times until we're already kind of in it, and those are the exceptions. Usually, as long as we have that information, 6 is the limit. It's always informed decision making. So if you bring us a donor that's 35 and her AMH is 1, it's not a no, but it's a let's have a conversation about what we're signing up for before you spend $40,000 to do this cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a crucial point.
Now let's talk about the legal requirements. Having a legal contract with your donor, is it mandatory or not? What kind of things have you seen there? What is your experience from that perspective?
Great question. When it comes to a legal agreement, if you're choosing frozen eggs, you don't have to worry about a lawyer or a legal agreement because the donor will have sort of signed away their rights to the eggs or the gametes when they donate it to the bank, and then you take possession of them from the bank so that you're the legal owner of those gametes. I would say that if it were me, or I always say if it was my sister, I would have a lawyer look at the contract that I'm signing with the bank just to cover my bases, because this is a lot. It's complicated. There's a lot of people involved, but not a requirement, just a suggestion. When it comes to fresh egg donors or sperm donors here at Markham Fertility Centre, we do require a legal agreement between any intended parent and the donor, whether or not it's a non-identified or identified donation. So in the old days, anonymous donations didn't require legal agreements, with the thought being that because they didn't know each other, the two couldn't connect and have a legal dispute. But as we talked about before, anonymity really just doesn't exist. And so we need to make sure that all parties are as protected as possible headed into this. So you will have a legal agreement established between the two of you before your cycle starts. And usually that legal agreement happens once the donor is medically cleared and before her cycle. So typically it's on kind of a short timeline, because usually when the doctors say everything's good, let's do this, people really want to get going, especially the donors. I always suggest to people to back it up and really be speaking to a lawyer from the beginning of when you're looking for a donor, so that you let all of the considerations that will be included in your legal agreement settle in, so that you don't feel so under the gun when the time comes to actually sign the agreement.
That's really good advice. That makes a lot of sense.
You've given us so much information about choosing an egg donor and about egg donation in general. Thank you so much. What do you wish that people who are contemplating using an egg donor, what do you wish that they knew starting the process?
Oh boy. Number one, we're not scary. Just come and talk to us and get the information. I think a lot of people are scared to even have the conversation because it feels really big and foreign and weird. And I'm sure that there's some like emotional roadblocks to even just being open to have the conversation. But I would say just come. You don't even have to physically come. We can talk by phone or have the conversation, get the information so that you at least know what you're saying yes and no to. And then 2, biggest thing that I will get out of my career is just banging the drum of really do your research and talk to the experts about talking to your child about the nature of their conception. There's still a lot of families that really wish to kind of keep that close to the vest and maybe not share that information. And we just know from so much research that this does a lot of damage to people who are donor conceived. And there's really great tools and resources that you can use out there to help support that process so that it's not so scary for you and it's not so scary for your child. And it just becomes a normal part of their upbringing. So really consider looking at that. Not to say that there's one right way to raise your child. Certainly there isn't. But it's really worth considering doing lots of reading and understanding and making conscious choices rather than just kind of trying to pretend like it was a thing that didn't happen. And then the other thing is, come into this with an idea of your perfect donor, your perfect idea of what this will look like, and then be prepared to flex. So keep that list of the things that you do not negotiate on, and then keep a list of the things that would be nice, but they're not necessary. And know that it might take time, but don't get discouraged. We will find you the donor. We will work with you and make sure that the person that you need is going to be there for you. It just might take some time. So give us some time.
That's great. I would add to that a lot of times, and you wouldn't know this stuff because you only see patients after they've made the decision to have an egg donor, but I see them before the decision is made, and I'm usually with them for a long time before they can get to the decision. And one of the things that I hear from patients when I meet them, let's say I meet them for the first time and they know they have decreased ovarian reserve, or maybe they're older, or maybe they have come from another clinic where a doctor said, you need an egg donor, don't even try with your own eggs, it's hopeless. And they've come to me looking for a second opinion. It's this idea of, I don't want an egg donor, which is perfectly fine to have that idea and to feel that this is not the way I wanted to create my family. I always tell patients by the time that you are actually pregnant with your egg donor conceived baby, the person who's sitting in front of me today say, I don't want this, that person will have changed and evolved and get to the point where this is something that you're willing to accept. I think patients have this idea that they're sitting here to be like, well, that's it. You have to have an egg donor and of the story, and that they're going to be forced into it. And that's just not the way we do it. Sometimes I do multiple cycles with patients that end up working and they never need an egg donor. And sometimes they don't work and they didn't need an egg donor. But that process of developing a relationship with the clinic, developing a relationship with the doctor, knowing that you tried everything, talking to people, doing your research, listening to a podcast like this, listening to other stories of donor conceived children, that process can help a lot of people get okay with that decision, which is okay to mourn and say, this is not what I wanted, but this is where I am. And I find that when people actually get there, this is a beautiful option for building families. And most of the people that do it with so much love and so much acceptance and so much joy. And it becomes this wonderful thing that they have in their life. And they're not being dragged into an egg donor journey.
100%. I think maybe important to say out loud because people feel really alone in this journey. The more people talk about egg donation as an option, the better. But right now, a huge part of the donor egg program are advanced maternal age moms who tried on their own for years. And now this is the next option. It's almost my full-time job to support families like this. And we're very happy to have you and know that you are not alone. There's lots of people doing this. And the other thing is sometimes we want to hear the optimist side and sometimes we don't. So only listen to this on the days that you want to hear the optimist side. But the benefit to sort of coming to egg donation, and I see it every day, I'm sure you guys do too, but the benefit to coming to egg donation as somebody who is in this advanced maternal age category is that pressure valve is released a little bit. You know, we can get pregnant for a long time after we're over 40 or, you know, have this advanced maternal age eggs. And so we've got time in terms of like biologically to get you pregnant. I know that everybody wants to be pregnant right away, but we don't have to panic so much about, well, if I miss this next cycle or if I miss this next cycle, because I see the anxiety of like every cycle, my eggs are just getting older and I'm losing my chances. And accepting an egg donor gives you this, like, I see it. People go, like, okay, like, I don't have to panic about this month. I've got some time. I bought myself some time. That pressure is relieved a little bit because we're going to get some young eggs and then we can work with your uterus, which is fine. Our ovaries are cruel and they age faster than the rest of us. The other thing that people often come to me when, like you said, where they're just sort of still working the process of choosing what's the right path for them. Are they going to continue down this road and, you know, they're having cycles that are failing and is egg donation the right route? People often hold a lot of guilt about cycling for themselves and working on egg donor at the same time. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can totally do both at the same time if you have the bandwidth to do that. You can be talking to us while you're still working through your own stuff for closure or for optimism or whatever. There's no judgment. We cheer you on no matter which route you choose or which route you're going. You can totally do both at the same time.
I think that is such a great point. Personally, when I'm counseling patients, I will often bring up the option of egg donation sooner rather than later. And I always tell people these are your treatment options. There's IUI, there's IVF, and then there's donor egg. And I will sometimes say, you know, for many patients in a similar situation as yourself, they will consider potentially using an egg donor because the pregnancy rates are much higher, whatever. And then I leave it at that, right? And I said, we don't need to talk about this right now. This is a big step. I completely recognize that might be a big leap, a mental leap, but I just want to leave it in your brain. Let it percolate somewhere in the back of your mind so that I just want to make sure that you know that this is out there and that this is a possibility. And this is something that if you are ever interested, I am happy to talk to you about. And I agree, pursuing things in parallel, again, if patients have the bandwidth for that, is totally reasonable. And it absolutely makes sense because for many patients, I know for myself anyway, too, being able to know what the plan B, plan C, plan D is really helps us deal with the anxiety of plan A, right? And knowing that, okay, if this doesn't work, I have a next step, I have a next option, and I kind of know a little bit about it. So then it seems a bit less scary. And that is totally reasonable, right? And we are happy to provide this information about donor eggs to lots and lots of people, even if it's something that you don't think you want to do. And to Dr. Garcia's point, with people who maybe have tried IVF, let's say with their own eggs, but they weren't successful, we have that discussion about advanced maternal age and egg quality and egg number and all of this. I always sort of leave this with donor egg is an option for many, many more years. So even if it's not something that's necessarily for you right now, it can still be in your mind. You can still let it percolate. And I'm happy to see you back in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever. And we can talk about it in more detail then because we don't have those same kind of time pressures as we do. And I've definitely seen it happen, where people have done IVF, they think that they're done their fertility journey, and then they come back maybe a little bit later ready to pursue donor egg. And that's also a very reasonable pathway as well, right? Of course, every person, every individual, every couple, their journey is so unique. But we are happy always to provide more information because at the end of the day, knowledge is power. We want you to know about all of your options so that you're making the best decisions that you can for yourself at that time.
Tell us a little bit about the timeline from the time that a person decides that they're going to use donor eggs, that would have been after meeting with the fertility doctor and the fertility doctor saying this is the right option for you. What happens then? What comes first? The legal counseling, the genetic counseling, the psychological counseling, the picking the donor. Can you walk us through that?
For sure. Every cycle is a little bit unique, but in general, you can expect your doctor will notify our team that you're interested in egg donation, and then you'll get an email that has tons of information that you can choose to read through, or just click the link at the top and book an appointment, and we'll talk about it together. And you'll meet with myself or a member of our team and go over basically fresh versus frozen, what to look for in a donor, what are your questions, what's this going to cost, what's the timeline going to look like, all of those sorts of things. And then from there, you're going to tell us when you're ready. So there is no pressure, there's no rush. You sit with it, you talk to your partner, you poke around on some websites, then you come back and you say, okay, I'm ready for next steps. Then we're going to get you connected with genetic counseling, and we're going to recommend that you book your psychological counseling if you haven't already. So at that stage, we recommend psychological counseling, genetic counseling, and then start looking for donors, whether that's through frozen egg banks or fresh agencies. Then you're going to go along and choose your donor. And while you're doing that, you'll be in contact with us as much or as little as you want for some feedback and some sort of support along the way in donor selection. Then you're going to find your donor. Then we'll talk about fresh donors because that's mostly what we see. Then we're going to, once you've matched with your donor, we're going to get your donor in. She's going to do her medical screening. We're going to keep you updated as that goes. She'll meet with her doctor to review the result. That doctor will make a recommendation to your doctor. You'll meet with your doctors to sort of review it. And then if everybody's good and happy, then you complete your legal agreement and we start your donor stimulation, hopefully on her next day one, as long as that legal agreement is complete.
We had talked so much today, and I think this is going to be one of those episodes that people can go back again and again and again. Tell us some parting thoughts. We've talked a lot about egg donor, but what would you want to say to an intended parent who is going through this process?
So one of the things, just putting sort of the donor conceived person in the middle of this. So the child that we're hoping to bring into the world, those are the reasons I come to work every day. And man, do I love seeing them when they get to come into clinic. One of the things that I just would love for every intended parent to hear is print your donor profile, print it out on paper and write notes to your future child about why you chose this person, what you looked at, what stood out to you on that profile. Write a note to them on that piece of paper. This, by the way, came from a psychological counselor. It's not my idea. But I think it's such a beautiful way to save and communicate with your child one day, because whether you choose to share with them now or in the future that their donor conceived, they will know that they came into this world from egg donation eventually. And we all the time get donor conceived people coming to the clinic whose parents had them here 20 years ago or through donation, and they're looking for information, and we have nothing. We just don't have information from that long ago, and profiles are not something that stays in the chart, but those are the personal things that those donor conceived children would like to know. And I think that having a letter from their mom or their dad or little notes about how they chose that donor is something that would be so special to that child. So really consider that little trick, and just know that we're here to support you. And man, this can be such a beautiful journey, and we often see lots of success. We're very happy to be able to continue offering this program. And big thanks to you guys and to MFC for supporting this program. I know it's unique and not necessary. I know you do this because you really feel like the patients deserve to have all of the options available to them. And so I'm really glad that you do. I love this job, and specifically donor and surrogacy is such a special place to be.
Well, we're very lucky to have you. Your passion for this program is so tangible. And yes, we as the owners, we do the work behind it. We had to make the decisions, but really this program wouldn't be possible without people like you and Carla and our admin team and the genetics counseling. So when we have somebody like you at MFC who's passionate about it, it makes our job as physicians and owners and medical directors so much easier, because we know that all the work that we're putting into the program is going to be rewarded by people like you who are transmitting that wealth of information, love, and support to our patients. We're so lucky to have you, and our patients are very lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Steph, you're an absolute rock star. And I love that we share a wall, our office are right next to each other. So it's always so handy because you're my wealth of information. Anytime I have a question, I'm running over to your office. Thank you for being so close and keeping your door open and letting me in.
Now you're making me jealous. I have to walk to get all the way to Steph's office.
That's when you're getting your steps in. No, but honestly, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure all of our listeners are just like mind blown over all this information. And I agree. This is an episode that people are probably going to listen to a bunch of times because there's such great information here. And I'm so pumped to share with everyone.
Oh, and we're coming back. We're bringing you back to talk about donor sperm in another episode, and gestational carriers in another episode, and embryo adoption. So there will be more of Steph to come.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast, or visit us online at markhamfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss. Music from Mix Kit Raising Me Higher by Ajay Stelino. My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.